Good afternoon once again to all our listeners, and thank you for joining us for another Al-Attiyah Foundation interview. And to our special guest today, Pierre Terzian. Welcome, bienvenue, and thank you for taking the time to join us for what I'm sure will be an excellent interview. Many of our listeners will recognize Pierre as the founder and CEO of Petrostrategies, which is noted for its publications on energy and also its consulting work. He is also a former Al-Attiyah Award winner. So welcome, Pierre.
It's a pleasure.
Pierre, since you founded Petrostrategies in 1985, you seem to have covered the whole possible range of oil, gas, and electricity industry topics. What topics are you focusing particularly on now? And is your current interest more on energy transitions in the context of combating climate change? And what else is getting much attention?
Well, it's energy transition, of course. Energy transition is at the center of all discussions. What is interesting here is to realize that the discussion about energy transition was enhanced, encouraged after the pandemic, especially, and also after the election of Joe Biden in the US. These two events made the discussion about energy transition even more intense than before. US Democrats believe deeply in climate change, and they said that they would make this subject integral part of not only of their internal policy, economic, social policy, but also an integral part of their foreign policy. And they are now playing again a leading role in the G7, for instance, or other places in energy matters and in climate matters. So, of course, the focus is on energy transition, clearly, yes.
Yeah, major focus, Pierre, as you quite rightly said, especially at the recent G7 meeting, and was mentioned, of course, in the final communique as well.
Yes.
Let's move on to, or start with the oil and gas industries. Have we, for example, reached peak oil yet?
Well, peak oil now is a matter of years. It's not anymore a matter of decades. It may happen next year, it may happen in 2025, whatever. We will definitely meet peak oil sometime before 2030, it seems. So this is a big change. Now the peak oil horizon is before us. It's here because in such a difficult matter as the transition, energy transition is, years are really, it's a very short period of time. Even decades are short. What about years? It's short not only for consuming countries, it's short also for producing countries so that they can reorient their economies, prepare for the after oil era, the post oil era. So I think the main event here to notice is that peak oil is definitely a matter of years, not anymore a matter of decades.
I have to admit to have looked up the exact definition of peak oil. So if peak oil is the hypothetical point in time when the global production of oil reaches its maximum rate, yes, after which production will gradually decline. So does that also apply to peak gas, or is that a different subject because of its role as a relatively clean transition fuel? And the forecast of increased gas demand from developing countries, coupled, of course, with population growth, causing pressures to quite literally electrify in Asia. So with all that in mind, when will we reach, or are we likely to reach, peak gas?
Peak gas may happen a few decades after peak oil. Yes, 2, 3 decades. I cannot say, of course, exactly when. Gas has advantages compared to oil in order to compete with other energies. Of course, here we can say that what is really interesting is to note that even if gas is much more cleaner than oil and much more cleaner than coal, there is a political will in some rich countries and also in some organizations like the International Energy Agency to fight not only against oil, but also against gas. Now, not all rich countries agree on this, on the fight against gas. For instance, Japan does not agree with that. In Europe, many countries do not agree with this approach. But there is definitely a political will to fight against gas in many rich countries. So peak gas will come sometime after peak oil, let's say 2 or 3 decades later, but we must take that into account, definitely. Yes.
And how would peak gas possibly be affected by climate change actions, do you think?
Well, the problem here is that at least in the beginning of this century or 2, 3 decades ago, hydrocarbon producing countries and companies, especially those with high gas reserves of production, did not understand the importance of fighting against coal. They did not focus enough on the fight against coal. Coal is the main source of energy of climate change. Coal is the main source of climate change. As this was recognized a few days ago by the G7 ministers when they met to prepare the G7 summit. They said in their final communique that coal was the main source of climate change. Now, we knew that, everybody knew that. And unfortunately, gas-rich countries, gas-rich companies did not fight against coal a few decades ago, so that gas could have better chances of alternate energy source. Now it's a little bit late, but it's not too late, because still gas has many big advantages compared to coal, and I hope that things will change in the coming years, even if there is a real political fight against gas as well as against oil.
Well, better late than never, Pierre. One of the subjects you have returned to often is the role of OPEC and now OPEC Plus. How do you see OPEC's role changing over the coming year, or will it just gradually lose relevance?
Well, I started following OPEC matters when I was a student at the university. So that's in the early 1970s. And after that, many things happened, wars, revolutions, etc. And sometimes people used to talk about the end of OPEC. Will that be the end of OPEC? For instance, the war between Iraq and Iran, etc. I never believed that it would be the end of OPEC, because all these countries needed OPEC because they needed oil revenues, and they couldn't have oil revenues, they couldn't defend oil revenues without OPEC. So I always thought and wrote in Petrostrategies that OPEC would survive. Now I think that there is a real danger for OPEC. With peak oil before us, the situation will change completely. When consumption of oil will start declining sometime during the 30s, next decade, let's say. Nobody can be more precise, I suppose. Then competition will start between countries having big oil reserves and wanting to produce these reserves, sell the reserves, especially because they will have, most of them will have the cost advantage. So they will not need OPEC anymore. On the contrary, they will be in competition against each other, while OPEC is a organization of cooperation, of market regulation, preserving the market equilibrium, etc. No, so yes, sometime during the 30s, I think OPEC will be in danger. Yes.
Well, you've also written about the effect of more diversified energy sources on the rentier, the commodity-rich economies. Are difficult times coming for these economies, or will their low cost of production save them, do you think?
Well, these economies, of course, can still rely on oil and gas. I cannot see them closing the fields while they have huge reserves. They will still use it. But it will be difficult because there will be a whole international environment imposing some limits on producing and consuming coal, gas, and oil. So they will have to switch more and more to clean energy sources. Some of them have started, some have not. And it's interesting to see that the countries that have started, I'm talking about oil and gas producing countries, right? It's interesting to see that countries that have started to diversify their energy sources with nuclear energy, solar especially, are those countries which seem to be more prepared for the post-oil era than the others. The most vulnerable countries are at the same time the countries which are not diversifying not only their energy mix, but they are not diversifying their economies. Now, some of them have historical reasons, like, for instance, if we take Iraq and Libya, Iraq is a destroyed country. Wars, sanctions, it's a destroyed country, right? When I was in the university, again, I remember this period of time, Iraq was a developing country, really a country which was on the road for development. But after the wars, things have changed. 3 big wars. Now let's take Libya, which is a more recent case, but with civil war, many destructions. That's also a very vulnerable country now. Take other countries which are not diversifying their economies, not diversifying their energy mixes, like Nigeria. Nigeria was a very rich agricultural country before oil. Venezuela, because of political instability. Azerbaijan, because they don't have a diversified economy. Kazakhstan, etc. So interestingly, these countries are not diversifying these economies and not diversifying their energy mixes.
Now, we talked a little about green futures. Major international oil companies, I would think pretty much all facing major challenges from their shareholders to persuade them to curb their emissions and become more climate friendly. Can you comment on this and tell us how you think this may force a response from national oil companies as well?
Well, the world is a real fact, and the world in which we are living is led by rich countries, developed countries, not only in terms of economic development, but in terms of think tanks, new ideas, elaborations, new technologies. They are leading the world. They are leading the subjects of discussions. They impose the subject of discussions. Yes, NOC is producing countries in a weak position. Take the latest example of the IEA report on so-called net zero report. That this is what we must do if we want to limit climate change in accordance with the Paris Agreement. For the first time, the IEA, which until that time played a hidden political role, started playing an openly political role. So openly political that many member countries protested against it. Of course, producing countries also protested. But really, I'm not very optimistic. I'm not very optimistic that things will change. Some oil-producing countries, some oil-producing companies have a chance, have a probability, but not all of them. Not all of them.
Right. Well, let's move on to hydrogen, which is being talked about, as you know, as the new so-called, in inverted commas, clean fuel. It's a conversion, is a conversion to a hydrogen economy possible, perhaps for difficult industries which require high temperature energy. And when do you think it will make true financial sense for companies to invest in green hydrogen? And what will be the factors that drive those investments?
Hydrogen is a new era for a new research topic. It's not yet mature. Many people do not know that hydrogen is not a source of energy. It's an energy vector, like electricity. Electricity is not a source of energy, right? Electricity is produced by energy sources, like natural gas, for instance, or oil or coal, whatever, transports. And then when we consume it, it converts back to energy. It's a vector. Hydrogen is much comparable to electricity. It's an energy vector. So the first question to ask is, how do we produce hydrogen? If we produce hydrogen out of clean energy, okay, it's a clean energy vector. Then you have to transport it. And imagine the whole infrastructure we need worldwide to transport energy through hydrogen. So we have to ask this second question. First question, how do we produce? And second, how do we transport it? These are not yet resolved problems, and I'm surprised to see very serious organizations making predictions about hydrogen without taking into account these very serious problems. Let me take one recent example. A few weeks ago, I think it was in April, the World Bank published a report saying that no, LNG is not the way to fuel the shipping industry. We should do that through hydrogen. Now, it was a shock because people said, I mean, it's unbelievable. To get there, it's imagine that we will fuel huge ships with quote unquote electricity, right? and I don't know who prepared this report, but they never thought about the feasibility of it. Now let's go back to LNG. Why LNG is a good way to fuel the shipping industry? Because not only it's cleaner than fuel oil, than diesel, etc. Not only it's a direct source of energy, not like hydrogen. It's not a vector. It's a source of energy. So much less losses when you burn the direct energy source. You don't lose so much energy than when you transport it, etc. And then there is a very interesting case. People are now working on carbon capture and storage and liquefaction from LNG on ships used to fuel the shipping industry, and then put the CO2 in depleted gas fields, etc. This is a very interesting research, full of promises, feasible, technically speaking, practical, very practical, not very costly. And I'm sure that when the International Maritime Organization will be obliged to impose some sort of taxation on the CO2 in the shipping industry, this alternate way of fueling shipping industry will get many big advantages. So even very serious organizations, when it comes to hydrogen, make very surprising mistakes.
Yeah. Well, I mean, do you expect hydrogen produced by green electricity will one day become possibly a reserve fuel, rather like a grid battery?
It can complement other energy or fuels. It can be useful in light transportation. It can be useful in even aviation for planes, but there are limitations, as I said, because of the fact that it's a vector, not a source, because we need huge grids, accommodation. So the hydrogen will definitely play a role, but it will take time, a lot of time, and it will be a limited role, I think.
You've worked or consulted with various national organizations and governments to produce national energy plans. Perhaps as we move towards COP26 and the difficult energy transition timetables, various governments are re-looking at their plans. What advice would you give them at this time?
Well, the first and most important thing is to keep in mind energy supply security. This is the most important thing. Planning on energy needs, first of all, to keep in mind that we must secure energy supply as clean as possible for the longest time possible, at the lowest cost possible, etc. If we forget that, we go into trouble, big troubles. It may be economic problems, social problems, and even political problems. So when I see this hurry, the people hurrying to find new transition ways, new energy transition ways, without taking into consideration this important factor, which is energy security, supply. Sometimes I'm saying, where are we going? I mean, it's very dangerous. Let's take a new case. A few days ago, I heard in Germany, the leader of the Green Party, and according to some polls, I mean opinion polls, she has a chance of being the next chancellor to succeed to Mrs. Merkel. Well, she said if we are elected, we will get to net zero by 2035. That's 13, 40 years.
Well,
it's impossible to do.
Yes, but never forget how cheap politicians' promises always are.
I mean, it's in a country like Germany. When you hear things like that, you think that energy transition, climate change, is not anymore a scientific matter. It's getting more and more political matters. I mean, it doesn't care what I say. What is important is that I get elected, and then after I will do whatever I will do. I will tell you that okay, my experts made a mistake. I cannot do it. This is a very dangerous road. When a serious matter like climate change, like energy transition, stops being a scientific problem, a scientific subject, and becomes a political subject, then that's very, 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 very dangerous.
I absolutely agree. I think that's all we have time for today, very sadly. On behalf of the Al-Attiyah Foundation, I'd like to thank you very much for joining me for this interview and providing the foundation with your excellent insights, advice, anecdotes, and much more. And I look forward to hearing from you again in the future. Thank you, Pierre.
Thank you, Stephen.